Barry. As you learned, Barry is an old pal from BC days. Thank you very much for this invitation, and also thank you for introducing me to my wife, which is a subject for another talk, another evening. But congratulations also on this terrific concept of the open classroom. I'm actually delighted to be here and have an opportunity to talk to you folks. Over the years, I have studied trends and patterns of retirement. By trends, I mean when people retire, and by patterns, I mean how they retire, how they leave their career jobs, and eventually the labor force. So in the next 25 minutes or so, and I'm actually going to start my clock right here, I will do the following. I'm going to show you some absolutely revolutionary changes in retirement trends that have happened in the U.S. over the past 25 years. Secondly, I'm going to ask why this has happened. Third, I'm going to conclude with news that's not news to economists, namely incentives matter. Fourth, I'm going to tell you what we've learned about how people retired, in particular about bridge and encore jobs, which leads into Phyllis' talk. And then finally, I'm going to take a look ahead and ask the question, have we entered a new era of retirement? And in case anyone has to leave or soon wants to leave, the answer is yes, we have. It's a whole new world out there. So let me put this in perspective. Oh, wait a minute. What the heck? I don't know. I have no idea how that got here. I apologize to Barry for that. Let me put this in perspective by reviewing retirement trends in the U.S. And as the Red Sox announcers say, let's go way back, way back. Dora Costa has documented the steady decline in employment rates of older American men back to 1850, 160 years ago before the Civil War. That's the percentage of a population who are still working. And here are data for men 65 and over, once called normal retirement age, and for men slightly younger, 55 to 64, once called early retirement ages. And if you squint, and don't worry about the little jigs and jags, you'll see a pretty steady decline for both groups for 110 years, from 1880 right through 1980 and 1990, and somewhat steeper declines since 1950. Let's look more carefully at the data since 1950. And here's some data that takes us up to 1985. Here are labor force participation rates for men by selected ages between 1950 and 1985. Again, you see very steady and significant declines. Look at that bottom row, the percent change in the labor force participation rates. In a mere 35 years, a demographic blink of the eye, we observe a nearly 70% decline for men age 80, from 50% to only 16% in the labor force. A nearly 60% decline for men age 65, from 72 to only 30% in 1985. And for men age 62, a decline of about 40%, from 80 to 50%. The average age of retirement, if you define it as the age at which half the folks are in and half the folks are out, in 1950, you had to go all the way out to age 70, that box up there, to find a labor force participation rate as low as 50%. By 1970, it was down to age 65 when half were in and half were out. And by 1985, it was down to age 62. That's a drop of 8 years in only these 35 years. So the bottom line is big changes underway during these 35 years, up until the mid-'80s, continuing a long prior trend going back an entire century. Now, there's lots of research on why men were retiring earlier and earlier over these 100 years, and in particular since the 1950s. The primary explanation is increasing wealth. As the nation became wealthier and people became wealthier, they spent some of that wealth on leisure late in life. People could afford to retire earlier, and they chose to do so. But also very important were financial incentives that were buried in public and private pension plans, Social Security and defined benefit pension plans. And we'll return to this topic in just a minute. Next, let's take an even closer look. And this is individual year data from the mid-60s to the mid-80s for 5-year age cohorts. In this case, men 60 to 64. And you can see there's an incredibly steady decline, the black diamonds, over this 20-year period. Participation rates were dropping about a percentage point per year for 2 decades. For slightly older men, 65 to 69, also a steady decline over these 20 years, almost a percentage point per year. And those are really trends. The points, the diamonds, lie almost exactly on a trend line, which is the white circles. Well, what about for American women, since all I've talked so far are American men? Well, there's very different patterns over these 20 years. Here, for example, are women aged 55 to 59. You'll see, in contrast to the men, there's very little change here. These participation rates were changing about a point per decade, not a point per year. It's true for slightly older women, 60 to 64. It's true 65 to 69 and 70. There were actually 2 offsetting trends underway for women. One, early retirement of folks, and secondly, the influx of married women into the labor force during those years, and they were pretty much knocking each other out. So this sets the stage up to the mid-1980s. A century of earlier and earlier retirement for men, especially from the mid-60s up to the mid-80s. And for women, in contrast, not much action during these 20 years. So the point of my talk is this. What's happened since then, since the mid-1980s? First, what's happened to the retirement environment, to the relative attractiveness of work and leisure late in life? And the answer is, what's changed from the mid-1980s? Almost everything. And then secondly, as I go through all the things that have changed, after I go through, well, what's happened to people's retirement behavior? How have folks responded to the new environment in which they live? Well, what's different from the mid-1980s? Well, the first thing that was different from the 1980s is a very strong economy until recently. It's almost hard to remember this, given the current crisis. But if you go back into the early 1980s, the unemployment rate declined from 10% in 1983 to 5% by 1989, and eventually got now near 4% in the early 1990s, the lowest unemployment rates since the late 1960s and the Vietnam War. There was strong labor demand during those 2 decades for all types of workers, including older workers. And that's very good news if you want to keep working. Yes, you can. Unfortunately, the economy and labor demand are cyclical, and this kind of good news comes and goes, as we have seen many times, and in fact, we're seeing right now with our 9% unemployment rate. But in addition to these cyclical changes through much of the post-1985 period, there were a number of permanent structural changes that don't go away like business cycles come and go. First of all, for example, was mandatory retirement. Mandatory retirement used to force folks to leave their jobs at age 65 and later at age 70, and it covered about half the American workforce. Well, in 1986, it was outlawed for the vast majority of American workers. And that's good news if you want to keep your job. Yes, you can. Secondly, very important changes in Social Security incentives. And this is the one part of the talk that's just a little bit technical. Once you're eligible for Social Security benefits, as many of you know, you can claim them, or you can keep working, delay receipt of benefits, and earn higher annual benefits when you claim them later. What's worth more to you over your expected lifetime? A benefit stream of Social Security checks that starts earlier, but with smaller checks, compared to a stream that starts later, but with larger checks? It's an interesting question. And it depends on whether the increase in annual benefits that come because you delayed and worked some more is sufficient to compensate for the Social Security benefits that you gave up during the delay. Are they enough to compensate you in the future for what you gave up? One can imagine setting up a system, a scenario, in which the 2 benefit streams are about the same, starting earlier with smaller checks or starting later with larger checks. Over your expected lifetime, you get the same amount. If this is the way it were set up, Social Security would be what we called actuarially fair or age neutral. It wouldn't matter when you started your benefits. You'd get the same amount over your lifetime regardless. Alternatively, however, you can imagine a scenario in which the value of your lifetime benefit stream declines if you delay benefits and work more. True, the annual benefits you get when you do claim them are higher than they would have been, but they're not enough higher to make up for what you gave up. You still earn a paycheck while working, but your net compensation is less than your paycheck by the size of the benefit loss. For example, if you continue to work after eligible for Social Security, earn $50,000, but your lifetime Social Security benefits decline by $10,000 during that year of work, well, your true compensation isn't 50, it's 50 minus 10, or 40. This is equivalent to a pay cut, a $10,000 pay cut, the way I've made up these numbers, that comes from the benefit calculation rules of Social Security. If this is the way Social Security is set up, well, a pay cut is a work disincentive, or alternatively, it's a retirement incentive. You're now making less than you used to. Well, back in the 1970s, after age 65, lifetime Social Security benefits did decline dramatically if you delayed taking benefits and kept working. It was our scenario too. There was a huge financial disincentive built into Social Security against continuing work after 65. The Social Security benefit rules, in essence, gave you a surreptitious pay cut. And worse, many employer pensions were set up in exactly the same way. Traditional defined benefit pensions penalized workers who stayed on the job too long. Together, these work disincentives, or retirement incentives, could be significant, and they strongly affected people's retirement decisions, as considerable research has made clear. The larger the lifetime benefit losses in Social Security or employer pensions or both from continued work, the more likely it was people were to leave the job and often leave the labor force. In other words, retired. Well, what's happened since the mid-1980s on this front? Well, first of all, these strong Social Security work disincentives after age 65 are gone. The laws have been changed. The delayed retirement credit, the reward from Social Security for working another year and delaying benefits, has increased from 3% to 8% for each year of delay. And 8% is about actuarially fair for the average worker. If you live your life expectancy, you get about the same amount from Social Security, whether you claim benefits at 62 or 65 or 68 or 70. That did not used to be the case. We're back to scenario one. The rules are pretty much age neutral. Well, that's good news if you want to keep working, because Social Security is no longer imposing subtle pay cuts on you if you work beyond 65. Well, what about on the employer front? Well, it's true, these exact same incentives, work disincentives, retirement incentives, still exist in defined benefit plans, but there's been a dramatic move towards defined contribution plans, which are the pensions of today and the future. And these are, by their very nature, age neutral. They're basically savings accounts. Your employer puts money in your Fidelity account or wherever you want it, and that account does not decrease in value because you choose to work another couple of years. The employer can't reach into your Fidelity account and take out $10,000 if you work another year, which in essence defined benefit plans can do. So as defined benefit plans have become less important and defined contribution plans have become more important, another strong retirement incentive has been dramatically reduced, although not eliminated. Again, that's good news if you want to keep working. Yes, you can. In addition, people are living longer and healthier lives. That's good news if you want to keep working. The nature of jobs are changing. We're moving away from manufacturing jobs and towards more service jobs. On average, fewer people have physically demanding jobs than used to be the case. That's good news if you want to keep working. Technology has improved during this time and will continue to do so. Many improvements in technology, like computers and hearing aids, have made it easier for older workers to stay working and increase the options about where one works. Additional flexibility. Also, good news if you want to keep working. Yes, you can. In addition, here's some bad news. Post-retirement health insurance coverage from former employers has declined and continues to decline. Further firms provide it, and when they do, the retiree tends to pay more of the premium. That's bad news, not good news like all these other things, but it's bad news that makes retirement less attractive because less coverage for your health insurance. And finally, we have lowered Social Security benefits across the board, although it's rarely described in this way. By moving the age of normal retirement from 65 to 66, which it now is, and from 66 to 67, as it will be, that is identical to an across-the-board benefit cut. Waiting longer for the same amount is identical to getting a lower amount at any time. Again, that's bad news for retirees, but it does make retirement less attractive. So given all these changes I've described, cyclical ones like the strong economy until 2008, and may it return soon, and these more permanent structural changes that I described, eliminating mandatory retirement, eliminating or reducing Social Security and pension work disincentives, the change in the occupational structure, improvements in health, longevity, and technology, the decline in post-retirement health benefits, we have changed the relative attractiveness of work and leisure late in life in favor of work. It's a whole new world out there. So, what difference has all this made in people's behavior? What's happened on the retirement front given all these changes in the retirement environment? Well, as one might have predicted, important changes in the retirement environment have led to important changes in retirement behavior. In fact, older men are not retiring earlier and earlier as they did from 1880 to 1985. In fact, they haven't been doing so for the last 25 years. A century-old trend came to a screeching halt in the mid-1980s and, in fact, has reversed. Here's some of the pictures that we looked at before. Here's the men aged 60 to 65. To the left of that vertical line is what you saw before. And I've just continued the trend line up to 2009 if those earlier trends had continued, and I've compared that to what actually happened. What actually happened is that gentle increase of the black diamonds, way above what would have been predicted by the prior trends. A dramatic break in trend, a trend that goes back 100 years. Here's our slightly older men, 65 to 69. To the left of the vertical is what you saw before. We continue it to 2009, and what actually happened? Participation rates are actually increasing, not decreasing. Here's the labor force participation rates for individual ages that you saw before. The top half of this is the old news. You see there that at age 62, between 1950 and 85, participation rates dropped by about 40%. Well, look at those same people from 85 to the present. They're up by 19%. 65-year-olds, where participation rates had dropped by 60%, they've now increased by 40%. And for the highest group, 70 and 72, they declined by about 2/3. And since then, they've increased by about 2/3. This little graph just shows the two summary lines. And you can see dramatic declines in labor force participation rates over 35 years have turned into dramatic increases in labor force participation rates by individual age in the last 25 years. What about older women? You remember the story on older women was quite different. Labor force participation rates were flat. They weren't declining. But what's identical about older women and older men is the dramatic break from trend. Here's the women we looked at before. To the left, you've already seen. To the right, a continuation of that flat trend compared to what happened. In fact, there's been significant increases in labor force participation rates of older women. Here's the women 60 to 64, older cohorts have exactly the same picture. And here's these numbers we saw before. Look at 62, 65, 68, 70, and so on the top half. These data only go back to 1970 rather than 1950. But declines of 13, 27, 20, 26, 5%. And look what's happened since then. For women 65, 68, and 70, the participation rates have approximately doubled. And for 72 as well, they're up by 50% for age 62 and 40% from age 60. The bottom line here is that many more older men and women are working today than those prior trends would have predicted. And since most of the changes in environment that I described that accompanied these dramatic changes in behavior are permanent changes in the environment, I think that we've entered a new retirement era. I don't see mandatory retirement coming back. I don't see strong Social Security work disincentives coming back. Defined benefit plans aren't coming back. Generous post-retirement health plans, I don't think, are coming back. Social Security is not going to get more generous. I don't see us lowering the age of eligibility for Social Security. I don't see longevity and health gains reversing, or jobs becoming more arduous, or technological change slowing down. In fact, the era of earlier and earlier retirement is over, and it's not coming back. Now, I'm going to mention only briefly a second topic. Not when, but how people retire, because this is Phyllis's topic. But our research has looked at this too. What do people do when they leave long-term career jobs late in life? Do they leave the labor force at the same time, retire all at once? Or do they move to another job, which we call a bridge job or an encore job? In other words, retire gradually in stages. Well, using a fabulous longitudinal data set, which Barry mentioned, which interviewed a large sample of about 12,000 older Americans and has re-interviewed them every 2 years from 1992 right up to 2010, and our research goes through 2008 because the 2010 data aren't available yet. In this data set, we go back in time through these interviews. We find someone's last career job, and then we walk with them forward in time and say, what do they do when they leave that career job? And it turns out that the majority of Americans, about 60%, when they leave their full-time career jobs, do not leave the labor force at the same time. Rather, they move to a bridge job or an encore job, often part-time, sometimes full-time, but of shorter duration than a career job. We find that these bridge jobs, and you can call it gradual retirement or partial retirement or encore careers, are a very important part of the American retirement landscape. Who uses bridge jobs on the way out? Not surprisingly, people who are relatively young when they leave their career jobs are more likely to do it. People who are relatively healthy when they leave their career jobs are more likely to do it. The self-employed are more likely to do it. And most interestingly of all, people at both ends of the socioeconomic scale are more likely to use a bridge job on the way out. Folks at the upper end who could afford to retire with generous pensions, but who want to keep working because they like what they're doing, pick bridge jobs on the way out, but also people at the lower end of the spectrum, people who really have no choice but to keep working after they leave their career jobs. So there are really two stories here, one of which I think is pretty upbeat, and it reflects the many positive attributes of work other than a paycheck. Many older folks want to keep working after leaving their career jobs. Perhaps not full-time, perhaps not on the same job, perhaps not even the same state. The other story, however, is less upbeat. Many older Americans have to keep working when they leave their jobs because they need the money or the health insurance. When I look ahead, my last topic, I see more of the same. Although the strength of the economy will ebb and flow, the changes in the retirement environment that I've described are permanent. We have shifted the balance, the relative attractiveness between work and leisure towards work, and people have responded as an economist would predict. When we had incentives that used to penalize people who worked too long beyond age 65, relatively few did. When these incentives were eliminated or reduced as expected, people's retirement behavior changed. Americans are now working longer and have been doing so for the past 25 years. For many Americans, then, retirement is not a single event. Rather, it's a process with several stages. And in general, I think this is a good thing, especially given current concerns that people have about the future of Social Security, the possibility of lower or later benefits, concerns about employer pensions, defined contribution plans, which have many advantages, but do have market risk implicit in them, as all of you learned in 2008 who had defined contribution plans, concerns about Medicare, concerns about post-retirement health coverage, concerns about the low savings rates that American has. This is not a pretty picture. What can an individual do about it? What can you do about Social Security rules or pension incentives or Medicare? Well, not much. You can write your congressman, but this is pretty much out of your control. It's too late for older workers to save more. That's something we should have done decades ago. So you can consume less in retirement or work a few more years. And our research shows that that's exactly what people are doing. From the nation's perspective, I think these new trends are mostly good news. What they show is there's a pool of talented, experienced workers out there, some of them right in this room, who are willing and able to work under the right circumstances. Employing more of them or employing them longer would be good for many of these individuals. A couple of more years of earnings can make a huge difference in the financial well-being during retirement. It's also good for the firms smart enough to hire these older, experienced workers, and it's good for the nation as a whole. The challenges facing an aging society are eased the greater the amount of goods and services we have to be allocated among the working and non-working populations. After all, it's goods and services that we're consuming, not Social Security checks, not pension checks. The more goods and services we have, and of course the more we have, the more folks stay working, the easier these difficult trade-offs that we face will be. So I will stop there.